All right, friends, let's open up to Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30. Now, I'm notoriously bad at walking and chewing gum at the same time, and I forgot to put this thing on, so I'm going to try to do this real quick. If you could imagine the music of, like, you know, the end part of Jeopardy where, yeah, that's it. Yeah, you guys can just hum that for a second. I'll be right with you. Perfect. Look at, well, yeah. That's hot, too. All right, well done. See, that's why community is important right there. There's a working illustration in that. All right, Genesis 30 is where we are. I know we read 31 this morning. We're going to get there in just a second, and I'll explain how we get there. But, you know, one of the things, we're still studying the life of Jacob, and one of the things that makes the life of Jacob so good for us to read is because we generally like flat characters. By flat characters, what I mean is we like things to be very clean. It's either black or it's white. It's either good or it's bad. It's either right or it's wrong. And one of the problems in the story of Jacob is he just defies being a flat character. Because every time you read something in the life of Jacob, you can find yourself asking, wait a minute, okay, so did Jacob do something right here? Or did he do something wrong here? Because the reality of it is Jacob's life, especially as we hit chapter 30 and forward, is going to be this mingling, if you will, of belief and unbelief, of believing that God is going to provide for him and still trying to scheme and do things his way. And this desire that we have to categorize people is just defied when we read the life of Jacob. Now, the reality of it is we know that doesn't work in real life. It's one of the reasons that relationships generally break. Is because what we do is we typically put people in a compartment, in a category. We think you say this, you do this, so you are this. And then when they defy those categories, we don't know how to continue on in that relationship. Because now I had already figured out who you were. But no, I haven't figured out who you were. That's why it takes a lifetime for spouses to figure out one another. That's why the story of a marriage is this continuous pursuit of one another, because reality is time changes you, both of you, and as you grow, it's not just that you're changing, it's that you didn't really know each other in the first place. And so you're spending this time trying to get to know one another. It's the reason that we can't understand when people do something that seems so totally out of character, and we say something like, I thought I knew them. Because we like to categorize people, put them in boxes, define them, and we like them to stay there. Well, Jacob defies this. I mean, we feel this. We experience this in our work life, right? When we go to work Monday morning and we lose our temper or we say something we should have, and the chatter behind us is, I thought he was a Christian. You just got put in a box. Nobody cares very much for that, right? We don't like that. We experience that. We feel this in our relationships, when in our friendships, when we evaluate a person's behavior and come to the conclusion that we must not really know that person at all if they'll do this thing. And that's what Jacob teaches us. Because here's what we're going to have in this chapter. In this chapter, we're going to get to see a little faith in Jacob. Yay! How about that? Like, that's really exciting. But at the same time, it's going to be mingled with superstition and treachery. All right, we're going to get it all. But here's the reality of it, right? I've just described for most of us, our Christian faith is a little bit of faith mixed in with some superstition and treachery. I'm going to go farther than that. That's the starting point. But really and truly, when we get to this chapter, we are going to see that. We are going to get to see Jacob respond in faith, and we're going to see two really important things about God's providence. Remember I said every chapter here is teaching us about two things. Providence, God's superintending of all events to accomplish his purposes, and God's grace, where God massively bestows grace on a guy that does not deserve it. And if we've established anything so far in the life of Jacob, it's that this guy does not deserve grace. Now, here's the good news of the gospel. Neither do I or you. You all said you, like you're talking to me. It's true. But yes, neither do you. None of us deserve God's grace. But he gives it to us richly. And so the key in this chapter is you're going to see God's grace to Jacob. We're going to see God's providence. We're going to see God working through Jacob. And we're going to see it in a contrast. We're going to look at Laban. And in Laban, we're going to see how God will work through an unwilling person. Right? God will accomplish his purposes. Right? Sometimes around us or in spite of us. And in Jacob, Finally, we're going to get to see God accomplishing his purposes through someone, but it's not that clean. There's this little bit of faith that's going to be mingled in with a lot of other stuff. Okay? So first, let's take a look at Laban. We're going to start in verse 25 today. We're going to go through the rest of chapter 30. We're going to read verses 25 through 36. And what I want us to see is this. God is going to work in spite of us sometimes to accomplish his purposes. He's going to work in spite of us. So let's start reading together in verse 25. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." Jacob said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you and how your livestock has fared with me, for you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything." I love that. I don't want nothing from you. "If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the speckled and spotted among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come to look into my wages with you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be as you have said." But that day, Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Okay, so over and over again up to this point, we've seen God's care for Jacob. Everywhere Jacob has gone, God has kept his promises. This chapter is no different. But so far, up to this point in his life, we can safely say that God's blessing of Jacob has been, in many ways, in spite of him. And we see over and over his disobedience. It wasn't because Jacob was obedient that he was blessed, which is hard for us because we like things to be in what? Neat little categories. We like them to be in neat boxes. The cause and effect works very well in our minds, right? But God has promised, and Jacob is doing his own thing, but God has still promised, and so God is going to continue to keep his blessing. You know, Jacob was wrong to try to steal Esau's birthright, yet God blessed him. Jacob was wrong to try to deceive his father, and yet God blessed him. Jacob was wrong to try and build a house for God, a little house for God, yet God blessed him. Jacob was wrong to have married 2 women and hated one, and yet somehow God blessed him with 11 children so far. Jacob's life so far has been about the massive grace that he did not deserve and being blessed in spite of his short-sighted disobedience. Now, the side effects of all these blessings are Laban's being blessed too. Laban is getting to reap the benefits of God blessing Jacob, and he's experienced this. He's, in many ways, you'll see he's very wealthy, right? And so there's this prosperity that's happening. Jacob is experiencing a prosperity as a result of the blessing of God, but it isn't because of his obedience. So Jacob's 14 years older, 14 years wiser, and he is ready to get out of Dodge. He is done with Laban. We're going to see that in the next chapter. He is done with Laban, and in many ways, the feeling is mutual. Laban still sees him as an opportunity, however, to make money, so he starts with a very common trick. So Jacob goes in and says, "Let me go," right? Verse 27, Laban says the first thing to him, "If I have found favor in your sight." Now that sounds, to us, it doesn't make a lot of sense, I guess, necessarily. First off, there's no way Jacob would have actually found favor in Laban's sight, right? And the feeling was mutual. But that's a common phrase that was used to flatter, to demonstrate a level of obedience almost. And so what's he doing? He's starting with the oldest trick in the book. Best way to keep somebody around that wants to go is to flatter them. That's not a good thing, but it's a trick, right? So what's he doing? He's trying to flatter him. Oh, look, if I've found favor in your sight, then he says this, which seems very disjointed, and it's supposed to. If I found favor in your sight, then I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. See what's happening here? Laban used wrong means to find the right truths. Now, divination is a phrase that kind of speaks to this pagan sort of ritual. There are lots of different ways to do this. All right, it's not real clear which one of these many different ways of hocus pocus that was being used in the day to try to figure this out, but somehow God used this so that Laban would figure out that it was the God of Abraham that was blessing him, because the question that Laban was asking, because we're going to learn later on, Laban has multiple gods in his house. He has little gods all over the place, right? He wasn't trying to figure out if God was blessing him. He was trying to figure out which God was blessing him so that he might be able to manipulate him and have him for his own, to put him in his little pantheon of gods that he was worshiping, right? So somehow through this process, Laban arrived at the conclusion that it was the God of Abraham. There's no way justifies what Laban did. This is where you got to understand the Bible's doing two things, right? Number one is that sometimes it's describing to you what is happening so that you will look at it and go, that sounds like a really bad idea. This is not something that I want to do. The Bible is full of those stories, right? We read a whole chapter full of those stories last week, right? That is describing to you what is happening. In no way is the Bible, it's one of the common oppositions that you hear to the Scriptures, is that it prescribes, for instance, plural marriage or having more than one wife. Man, it never does that. Man, in fact, every time the Bible brings attention to having more than one wife, it shows you all the horrible effects of it, right? And so there's this describing what's going on, but then there's also a prescribing section where there's also a part of the Bible where it's telling you what to do. This is descriptive. Laban performed divination. God somehow, because God wants his name to be exalted and glorified in the life of Jacob, and at this point, Jacob's not doing it. And so God is working around Jacob. He's working around Laban, and he's still seeing his name exalted. You know, we see this in a couple of places in the Bible. You have this later on in 1 Samuel 28, when Saul's in trouble and he goes to this witch, and she's trying to perform this seance. And the Bible's not saying that's a good idea. It's saying that's what he did, and he got exactly what he was going for, but it was not what he wanted. You could read that chapter later. All right, he basically got told, man, you're in real trouble, Saul. Bye. That's basically the short version. And so, you see this over and over again in the Old Testament especially, but sometimes also in the New, where people will be doing things, and the Bible encourages you. It wants you to use your brain. Okay? God gave it to you for lots of reasons, but I would contend that the primary reason that God gave you your mind was so that you could know him, which means when you come to the Bible with your mind engaged. And you get to a story like this, and you say, wait a minute, this doesn't seem like a thing God would want me to do. And then you read later on, and you go, no, this is really not a thing God would want me to do. So why did Laban do it? And the answer is because God's name is going to be exalted and glorified through the life of Jacob, even if Jacob refuses to do it. That's what it's after. That's what it's showing you, right? Is that somehow God's not going to be manipulated, but he will be glorified, right? And so, the end of this section, you see Laban then trying to deceive Jacob. It's like these two hucksters trying to trick one another at the end of this passage, right? Laban's like, well, what can I do for you? And I love how Jacob says, you should not give me anything. I don't want anything from you, Laban. You have given me enough. I don't need anything. And so then he says, but here's what we'll do. Okay? And then he starts to describe this story of what he wants to do. And what a short version, what he wants to do is he wants to go through and get the spotted and the speckled and the black animals, both lambs and goats, right? And so there would have been mostly solid-colored sheep. In fact, I'd venture to guess that most of us haven't seen a spotted or a speckled sheep. There is a such thing. It's actually a sheep called a Jacob sheep. It's a really cool picture, and I was going to use it, but the picture's copyrighted, and so I can't do that. But it is really awesome. You can Google it, and that's free. And so there's a speckled sheep, right, that literally exists, has 4 horns. It's really crazy looking. But really and truly, that was a thing. But there wouldn't have been very many of them. So Jacob's not asking for much here. He just wants all the animals that are spotted or speckled and the black lambs. And so Laban's like, sure, go ahead. That's great. And then he lets Jacob go, and then you can kind of see him in the back going, okay, here's what we're going to do. And then he goes into the herd, and he takes all those animals so that Jacob wouldn't find any, and he sends them off with his son 3 days' journey away. He did that because Jacob's already agreed that this is the way to go. But then when he gets in the herd, what's he going to find? Nothing. Nothing. So he thinks Jacob's going to be stuck with me. But God's plan is not going to be thwarted. We're going to see that at the end of this chapter, right? So there are two. We think about what Laban is up to here. There are a couple of real tragedies in what's going on when we think about Laban and the way he's dealing with Jacob. And here's the first one. The first great tragedy is this. Laban, in this chapter, in this section, confesses that God has blessed Jacob, but he does not confess that God has blessed Jacob because Jacob has taught him that. He confesses that God has blessed Jacob because he had to find some other means by which that happened. Just think about the places that God has put us. How tragic would it be for God to move around us, to influence people to glorify his name, and not have moved through us? That people would come to Jesus and we would have literally nothing to do with it, no influence, no impact, that people would grow in their love for Christ, but it wouldn't be because we had relationships with them. It would be because God decided to move because we weren't. God used other means because we were static. Because the reality of it is God's plan will be accomplished. You know, there's this really horrible philosophy that we can take to very easily in the church, that somehow we think that God needs us. Let me relieve you of the burden of feeling like you are somehow responsible for supporting the greatest being in the universe. God does not need you, nor does he need me. His name will be glorified, his purpose is accomplished, and the idea is not we have to partner with God to do something, otherwise it won't happen. It's that we have been blessed with the benefit of being able to work and see the kingdom of God accomplished. That's not what Jacob has done up to this point. Up to this point, Jacob's just been Jacob. He's deceived and he's lied and he's tricked. And somehow, even in the midst of that, God has revealed to Laban that it's the God of Abraham and Isaac that's blessing him. That's really, really tragic. The other part of this is just how doggone hard-headed Jacob is. After 14 years, you would think this man would be totally reformed, right? You'd think he'd be a changed dude. You'd be like, okay, he's got 14 years, a day in and day out, living with the repercussions of your own dumb decisions, and you think at some point you just learn. It's coming, but it's going to take an even more dramatic experience than this in the life of Jacob for him to learn, right? And that's tragic. So when we see this, what we see is God is going to do his thing. He's made a promise to Jacob. He made a promise to Jacob's father Abraham, or grandfather Abraham, long before this, and he's going to keep his promises. Look, God made a promise to this world that his name will be exalted and glorified, my friends. And his name will be exalted and glorified. And it will either be because he has used us as instruments of grace to demonstrate his goodness to the world, or it will be because you chose to be static and inert and inactive. You chose not to do the hard work of killing sin in your life and so demonstrate the changing, transformative power of the gospel, or it will be because you have submitted your life to Christ. He doesn't need you, but you need him. That's what we see in the life of Laban. He will accomplish what he has set out to accomplish. In the second half of this passage, we're going to see this. There's two alternatives. That's the bad side. God can work around us. But here's the good side. God can work through us. And the even better news is it doesn't take much. So let's read verse 37. Watch this. Verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus, the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Okay, I'm going to explain this. This is one of the more difficult sections in Genesis to really unpack. Okay, so I'm going to break all that down for you in just a second. Here's what you need to know. This is the battle royale of deceitful people in the book of Genesis right here. Okay, you got Laban on one side and Jacob on the other, and they're trying to figure out who is the cleverer of the two of them, right? And so you've got this picture. Here's what's, understanding what was believing at the day. Laban believed first that solid-colored animals will always have solid-colored offspring, right? He believed that speckled and spotted animals would always have speckled and spotted offspring. It's a matter of using your eyes. Again, keep in mind, people who lived in this time weren't dumber than you, but they didn't have access to some of the same things we have access to, right? And so that's really what his belief was. And so he thought he could take them all and Jacob would get nothing. So you can almost kind of hear Laban gloating about what he's doing. But God will not be thwarted. So here's what Jacob is doing, and then I want us to run over to Genesis 31 for just 1 second, okay? What's happening here is Jacob is peeling some sticks, okay? He's got the flocks, he's going to peel some sticks, and he believed, or there's this superstition, if you will, that whatever was exposed on a stick, whether it was a stripe or a spot, whatever was on the stick when it was in front of the female sheep, that's what the sheep would turn out to be. If it was a long stripe, it'd be a striped sheep. If it was a little spot, it'd be spotted sheep. That was a common superstition of the day. Now, we can laugh at that all you want to, but I've grown up around enough agricultural people to know there are about a bazillion agricultural illustrations that are superstitious that are still at work today. In fact, I bet if I asked some of you what it meant that the forsythia blooms early, you could tell me that it means that there's either, it depends on whether you're northern or southern, whether it means there's 3 more snows or no more snow, that you're not supposed to plant on Friday the 13th, that you certainly don't ever, you keep your rows north and south or east and west, but you don't ever go north, south, and east, west. All that stuff's superstitious. So don't tell me these people were dumber than us. They were at least equally as dumb as we are. Okay? The intention of the whole thing, however, was to try to manipulate the outcome, right? So then, now on top of that, he gets smart. He also very carefully picks the strongest animals, and those are the animals that he intentionally breeds, and then guess which animals he takes. He doesn't take the lambs from the weakest animals. He takes the lambs from the strongest animals. So you've got this mix of human cleverness and superstition going on in the life of Jacob. But there's another thing going on here. And in order to get there, to get to 31, you got to understand how the Israelite person liked to hear and tell stories. And the reality of it is, they like to hear and tell stories a whole lot like we Southerners like to hear and tell stories. We have, maybe you don't, I have a great affection for rabbit trails. I thoroughly enjoy being able to just chase this trail and talk about this thing on the side. And so when I tell you a story, I'm not telling you a linear story like I did this, and then 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 in the end, right? Now, some of you would greatly enjoy that. I get that, but that's not really how storytelling works, right? The art of storytelling is to tell a little bit and then have this little aside that kind of goes off here, and then tell a little bit more, have this little aside that goes off here. So you get to the end of chapter 30, and if you don't read chapter 31, in fact, I'll be honest with you, I did that for a long time. I got to chapter 30, and I just thought, everything's moving in a line. That's great. But in chapter 31, look at what's happening here. Verses 10 to 13 are going to explain what's happening in chapter 30, okay? Chapter 31, verse 10. Here's what Jacob is saying. He's talking to Rachel and Leah. We'll get to that next week. But here's what he says. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. And the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now, arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. So what he's telling us in chapter 31 was what he saw before this whole scene started to take place in chapter 30. You guys follow me? He's telling you a story, right? You get to the end of chapter 30, and you're like, man, did God really give him all these striped and spotted and speckled animals because Jacob peeled a bunch of sticks? And the answer is no. God gave him a bunch of striped, speckled, and spotted animals because he told him in a vision, I'm going to do this. But here's the problem. You see how I said it's not flat. It's not easy. You've got Jacob hearing the Lord and staying where God told him to, and then peeling a bunch of sticks and putting them in water troughs. Right? There's this mingling of belief and unbelief in the life of Jacob that makes it so very much like our Christian lives. In fact, I did a little research on superstitions via Facebook this week. Some of you may have saw it, and I had a really long list. I started out responding to every Facebook message, but that was unwise because I had other things to do with my day, and I heard all kinds of incredible superstitions. But the reality is we still live this way. You know, the thing that makes superstitions so appealing to us is that they attempt to provide explanations for things that don't have explanations. And they attempt to reduce life down to a predictable formula that we can control. Now, I think, I don't have any hard research for this, that the two most superstitious types of people in the world are farmers and sports fanatics, generally speaking. And I say this from having spent a lot of time around people who farm and having a deep affection for several sports. In fact, my Green Bay Packers beat themselves last week, and about halfway through the game, I had to do intentional battle with my own soul to not put on a different jersey because clearly the one I had on was not working. And I lost. I still changed the jersey. And then I thought, I'm preaching this week on superstition. But here we are. All right, here we are, all together, community, all cards on the table. I have to fight it too, right? But we do. We have all of these. Some of the things that I asked, though, were a lot more serious. When I started asking people on Facebook, I said, what are some of the superstitions that we're tempted to believe, right? And there are a couple that I wanted to point out to you. One is, if something bad happens to you, it's because of the karma that you have developed over the course of your life. You guys understand that karma is a Hindu concept, not a Christian one. And for us to even use the word karma incites a level of paganism that the Bible does not support, right? That there's really and truly, I mean, what you're saying is karma is this idea. There's no such thing as good karma, by the way. People talk about good karma. If you're going to use the word rightly, karma is just bad, right? But what happens is the more bad you do, the more it just kind of builds up over your life, and eventually you just get to the point where enough bad things have happened that you've done enough bad things that something bad is going to happen to you. What did I just do? Is what I said, the temptation of superstition. Provided explanation for something that doesn't have an explanation. Why in the world do bad things happen to good people most of the time, and then bad things happen to bad people some of the time, right? And then I attempted second to reduce life down to a predictable formula that I could control. You do enough bad, it's going to come back around and get you. But here's the reality. First off, as an aside, remember I was talking about rabbit trails? We'll get ready to chase one. All right, this idea that somehow God is punishing you, because that was another one on here. If something bad happens in my life, it must be because God is punishing me. That is just superstitious nonsense. You got to stop, okay? Because what you're trying to do is reduce life down to something that you could manipulate or control. You're trying to give an explanation for something that sometimes just has no reasonable explanation. Sometimes bad things just happen because this world is broken, right? But we want to explain things. Another one. God helps those who help themselves. Right? That's a slogan. It's also, I've seen people live it as though it was a superstition. You share the gospel with somebody and they say, well, I'm a pretty good person. That is superstitious nonsense. You know you are not. That's not what the Bible says, at least. Let's take it to the word, right? What about tithing? Tithing, most people who, when they talk about tithing, their immediate thing is, man, I gave, and God just gave back to me even more than I gave. Well, that may be true, but it's really hard to make that into a statement that is always true. Because here's the reality. What if God didn't give it back to you? Would you have given it anyway? Because that's generosity, right? The other way sounds like some form of spiritual bribery if we're not careful. And so we've got tons of these, right? We've got a whole lot of them. I could keep going, but here's the reality. Sometimes the things happen in our lives defy explanation. And sometimes, well, actually none of the time, God will not be manipulated. He will not allow you to manipulate him. And you're very, very, look, you know what happened? I changed my jersey, and guess what happened to my Packers? They still lost, right? That was a perfect, I was trying to figure out why they lost the game. It was so that I could use this as an illustration. But it is truly, we need to be reminded often, you can't manipulate the plan of God. And no amount of four-leaf clovers and lucky rabbit's feet or whatever it is that we tend to lean on in our lives to somehow give us the emotional support that we actually are in control of our own destinies is all a facade. It's just all fake. And we've got to stop that. We can't believe luck. We don't believe in luck. We believe in providence. That's a way better word for a Christian to use, man. Right? God is providentially controlling events. So did any of these sheep give off the colored lambs that God had promised because Jacob put a bunch of sticks in a water trough? And the answer is no. Okay, glad we're all on the same page, right? But we try to flatten this out. Let me tell you something. Almost everybody I read this week as I was doing research for this sermon, it went on one side of this thing or the other. Faithful Jacob believes God, and so the stick thing is just, I heard people try to justify the sticks and say that he knew that it was going to provide extra nutrients to the sheep and that they were going to end up being healthier and thus do this thing. And then I heard people on this side that say that Jacob was just totally bought into the superstition, and and this just proves that the Bible is not true. I've read that. Listen, the answer is none of those things. Somebody can be both believing that God has promised and trying to help him along. You don't believe me? Watch your own self tomorrow morning. That's what we do. All right, we can believe that God is going to do something and yet still try real hard to manipulate the outcomes in the ways that we want them to be. We are very much like Jacob. But we don't like that. We like people to be flat. And so he's not, right? But God will work to accomplish his purposes. At the end of this, what do you see? Jacob is massively blessed, right? Look at verse 43. Thus, the man increased greatly, had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. I mean, this doesn't sound like riches to us, but you need to understand first, the very fact that there's camels in this mix means that Jacob was extremely wealthy. We typically think, because we've seen enough living manger scenes, that everybody had a camel, that having a camel was like having a lawnmower, but it's not. Like, that's not how the Bible was. That's not how the era was. And this time, if you had a camel, you were wealthy. I mean, extremely wealthy. If you're gonna to convert this to modern language, you may have well said, thus the man increased greatly, had large flocks, female servants, male servants, Lamborghinis, and donkeys. I mean, it was an animal that almost no one could afford. And so you see Jacob, boom, exploding. God's blessed him richly, right? Why? Because God has promised. He made a promise to Abraham. He made a promise to Isaac. He made a promise to Jacob. And Jacob has done a terrible job of living in obedience to God. And yet God made a promise, because God will keep his promises. And he will work to accomplish his purposes. But the reality of it is, our lives generally are this mingling of faith and unbelief. I think it's hard for us to come to grips with that. It's hard for us to admit that. But here's the reality of the fact. If your life was not laden with unbelief, you would not sin. Because the very essence of sin is unbelief, right? Think about how Satan tempted Eve in the garden. What did he say? Did God really say? Unbelief. That's the starting point for all sinfulness. God doesn't have my best interest in mind. God's not going to accomplish this purpose. I have something better than God has for me. Whatever God said is not that important. What I want is more important. Those are generally your starting points for most of your sinfulness, right? But the good news of the gospel, when we started talking about Jacob, is that it doesn't take much. Just a little bit of faith. What did Jesus say? Faith the size of a mustard seed. The cool part about the life of Jesus is we get to see this working out in Mark chapter 9. If you want to do your Bible drill, you can flip over here with me. If not, I'll tell you the story. But it's better if you read it on the page. Mark chapter 9. So to set it up, here's what's happening. Jesus has taken the disciples up to the top of the mountain, not all of them, just some of them. All right, for the transfiguration, right? He's took them up, Peter, James, and John. They've seen him glowing radiantly, right? They come down the mountain, And as they come down the mountain, they're walking into this argument between the scribes and this group of people, right? So verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And they asked him, why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And so you see this happening. Now, verse 14. When they came to the disciples, okay, they're coming back to the rest of the group, they saw a great crowd among them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw them, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, what are you arguing about with them? And someone from the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And he answered them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. So Jesus sees this, and he hears this explanation of a dad who loves his son, who has been possessed by a demon since childhood. He's explaining the times that this demon has cast him into fire and water to destroy him. Do you see this? Do you see what's happening? Can you imagine, moms and dads, having a child possessed by a demon who has often tried to murder your son? Can you imagine? The heartache, the pain, the agony that this guy is experiencing. Again, not flat characters. This guy's coming in with deep wounds. And he gets here, and what does he get from the scribes? They're arguing with him. Isn't that interesting, right? What does he get from the disciples? They can't do anything. So here he is at the end. He's hit the bottom, if you will. He is hopeless that there's anything that can be done. So Jesus said, he says, immediately bring it to me. He said, they brought the boy. When the spirit saw him, immediately, the spirit sees Jesus, verse 20. It convulsed the boy. He fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him?